Isn't that just beautiful? I love the look of this counter, and it's extremely strong and durable. The best part is, though, it basically requires no artistic ability to make one yourself, so let's go over the steps required. Very quickly before we begin, this project involves sharp objects, epoxy resins, and fire. This is not a safety guide. If you don't know how to work safely with these hazards, find someone who can, or find an appropriate safety guide before working. MTG Degree is not liable for any harm caused by this guide, physically or otherwise. Let's talk first about the best card art for this 3D process. So there's two things that you want to stay away from. First is a card like Skaldkin. When you look at Skaldkin, it's very difficult to define the borders of this subject. It's an elemental, it's very airy, so that is very hard for you to decide where to cut. Or, let's look at Air Elemental, this specific printing. There is absolutely no background, just a simple gradient. This makes it very hard for you to create a 3D illusion because there's very few layers that you can make. In contrast, when you look at the card Flying Crane Technique, subjects are well defined with a layered background. We are going to use Emancipation Angel, because I love angels. Some people may think that this requires a lot of artistic skill. I assure you, it doesn't. All you need to get started is your common sense ability to judge distance. So let's plan out the layers for this 3D counter together. The first layer is just the entire card. Then we ask ourselves, what's the furthest thing away from us in this image? The answer is the blue sky. So we cut that out and make the resulting card another layer. Then what's the next closest thing to us? Well, the clouds. So basically we cut out everything except for the mountains and the angel. The next closest thing are the mountains and lake in the background. So we are going to cut those out, leaving us with just our angel. Now we have to decide all of the layers within this angel itself. So let's just look at it. The first thing that's the furthest back are her back wing, and in my opinion, her gown billowing out to her left. So we cut that out and make a layer. The next closest thing to us are her torso, face, and the dress billowing out to her front. With the final layer containing only her right wing and her right arm holding the sword, we're done with our layers. And look how 3D it is! The first step in this process is to cut out some spacers. Now you'll see that I've found cards that are from the exact same set, some commons that I picked up for very cheap, and I'm cutting out the box that has the art and the box that has the text box. Now, why a card from the same set that you have to make these spacers with? Well, I've found that even when the borders were considered the same, actually they were moving around the borders in the printing process by 0.5 millimeter here, 0.5 millimeter there. So if you use cards from a bunch of different sets and cut out these two boxes, they actually won't line up perfectly. Now we're done cutting out these spacers and we've got a nice little pile. Next, we take the spacers and we make all of the edges of them black using a Sharpie marker. This will make the inside of the text box black, the inside of the art box black, and the outside of the counter black. Cutting the art layers is the most stressful part of this process, so let me give you a few tips. First, buy an X-Acto knife for accurate cuts with sharp turns. I'm using a box cutter here because I couldn't find one in a local store. Make the longest single cut possible for smooth edges. And take your time. If you rush, you will cut too far at some point through your foil and be sad. Now, I'd like to mention the use of foils in this process. Not only does the epoxy process make them extremely shiny, but they take to epoxy much better than non-foil cards. Non-foil cards absorb epoxy in the paper layer on which the art is printed. This makes the ink bleed all over the place around your cut marks in the final 3D altar. Since the image on foils is printed on foil and then sealed with gloss, the ink will not run if you use a foil card for this process. If you want to use a non-foil card, You can stop the ink from running by using an art sealant on all of the layers that you cut, making sure to spray the edges. Next, we have to glue together all of these layers. Now, the most important thing while gluing is that when you're gluing the area around the art box, you want to make sure that there are no gaps whatsoever. If there are gaps, then when you pour in your epoxy later, it can leak out through the sides of your counter. Now, what glue do I use for this? I really enjoy this Scotch Scrapbooker's applicator. It's got this fantastic glue in it, which dries pretty darn quickly, and it doesn't react with any epoxy that you might be using. At the same time, the applicator on one end is very good at putting thin layers of glue on your magic cards. Now, I like to glue about 4 layers at a time, and then go put those 4 layers underneath a small stack of books to dry. The reason that I don't do more is because I want the glue to get compressed as soon as possible. In addition, I've tried doing many layers, like 20 layers at once, and I find that when you put the books on top, you don't know whether or not it's shifted the layers at all when there's so many. With something like 4 layers, it's much easier to control. You'll notice as I glue this together that I've cut little nicks in the side of the text box in order for the rods of the abacus counter to settle in there. Now, what are the rods that I'm using? I'm actually using construction nails where I've cut off the tip and the head of the nail and use it as a very sturdy rod. After I've got all of the layers glued together, I like to let them sit under a pile of books for about 4 hours to fully dry. Now it's time to add the epoxy layer. I have to suggest the use of easy cast epoxy at this stage. It has a very easy mixing recipe, dries extremely clear, doesn't yellow with time, and has a long liquid working time unlike many epoxies. As with any epoxy though, work outside or in a room with a lot of ventilation. As you see here, I've mixed equal parts of the 2-part epoxy in disposable cups. Take the 2 parts and mix them together for a good 5 minutes. This will make sure that you have a homogenized mixture. There will be small bubbles in your mixture at this stage, but don't worry about them. Whenever you pour this epoxy, don't expect to ever remove it, so make sure you're using disposable items and your pouring area has a disposable mat underneath it for spills. When pouring onto your 3D altar, only pour directly in the center. If you pour near the sides and drip over an edge, your epoxy will want to flow off of that wet edge from that point onwards, so just pour in the center. Once you've filled up that center area, take a toothpick or nail and pull the epoxy from the center of the card to all of the edges. Don't rush this, you have plenty of time before the epoxy sets. Our goal is to add about 1 millimeter of epoxy on the entire front face of the card. Do not add too much epoxy. If you do, it will begin to flow off the edges of the card and into the abacus counter box. Once you're done, put a bowl over the altar. This will stop any dust in the air from settling in your epoxy layer while it dries. Now that our epoxy is drying, we have to deal with the air bubbles. Now, the company says that the air bubbles will just all pop on their own, no problem, but I find that to be not 100% accurate. So, the way that you deal with them is about every 15 minutes for the first 2 hours, go to your drying epoxy. You'll find that the air bubbles that have risen to the top will pop extremely easily if you can pass some hot air right above them. I use a creme brulee torch to do this, but you could also use something like a windproof cigarette lighter that has a little jet of flame. Now your goal is just to get the hot air pushing against the air bubbles. You're not really trying to shove the flame into the epoxy because you can burn it. My advice would be to start very far away and get closer until those air bubbles pop. After doing this every 15 minutes for about 2 hours, leave it sit to dry for 2 whole days. This epoxy dries extremely slowly, and you really want it to be fully hard before you pick it up and do things like get fingerprints stuck in it. Your hard work and patience have paid off. You now have a beautiful, shiny, tough, useful 3D altar to use at all of your Magic the Gathering games. If you follow this guide to make a 3D life counter, try doing it with a cheap foil first. Don't go cutting up all your foil snapcasters for your first try. If you found this video interesting or useful, please give it a like, and if you want to see more, you can hit that subscribe button. As always, I'll see you next video.